these events in person in the future. And certainly we'll make sure you have an opportunity to connect with the speakers, myself and Lee Kellert with Jaffe Law Firm at the end of this session. So we have over 100 clients now that we work with at Centrepolis Accelerator, and many of which are in the process of fundraising. So I'm hoping that this is of value to you, and would like to see what we can do to help provide your fundraise and all of the things that are required in helping prepare your company for investment. We like this to be kind of an interactive session. So if you have any questions, if you're familiar with Zoom, at the very bottom, you have an opportunity to, on the screen, to hit the chat button, and the chat button will allow you to submit your questions. All participants are on mute. So the only way to submit a question is through the chat function. So as we go through this, I'll be looking at the chat function and questioning Lee and addressing your questions. So need to advance. So today we're going to have a conversation with Lee Kellert. He is a real expert in investment law with Jaffe Law Firm here in Southfield, Michigan. Real expert in helping companies prepare for investment, how they need to incorporate and prepare to speak to investors, and also I spent a lot of time in mergers and acquisitions and supporting companies, both startups as well as well-established firms. So we're lucky to have him today. Thank you, Lee, for joining us. So first, I'd like to talk a little bit about Centrepolis Accelerator and who we are. Our mission is to help those that have hardware and physical type of products that they're developing, support their commercialization, and more importantly, help them design, engineer, prototype, and manufacture their products right here in Michigan. We're well connected to the manufacturing community here and product development community. And we also use the Lawrence Tech faculty and students to help with proof of concept, testing, and other measures to help with a company's development of their product. The Centrepolis Accelerator was developed in partnership with Lawrence Tech University and the city of Southfield. We designated a smart zone by the state of Michigan, and now are funded by the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and by Eagle, as well as New Economy Initiative and others that support our mission for entrepreneurship and specifically for development of manufacturing technology businesses. One thing that's unique about our accelerator is we not only help startups, but also small businesses, really anyone that has an idea for a physical product or advanced manufacturing technology and has the opportunity to create economic development and job creation and investment in the state of Michigan will support. We use as kind of the foundation or building blocks for education and training and support. The Build for Scale training curriculum you see here, this is something I played a role in developing. And it's really kind of product development and manufacturing 101, but over 900 minutes of education and a lot of different templates to help support product design, engineering, prototyping, and manufacturing. Centrepolis has two vertical accelerator programs. One is focused on clean tech hardware companies. It's funded through Eagle and the Michigan Energy Office. We have a small funding pool to help product development for clients that have clean tech related hardware. We also launched, in partnership with Automation Alley and Lean Rocket Lab, an Industry 4.0 accelerator, the nation's first. We have a $1.3 million seed fund to support companies with these technologies, and many corporate partners that are a part of the program to support pilots and demonstrations and strategic partnerships with the companies coming through that program. That's a global accelerator and available for any company in the state of Michigan or even outside the state or country. And it offers up to $110,000 seed investments in each company that we decide to work with. We also have a manufacturing technology or ManuTech incubator that focuses on working with those that have manufacturing related technologies, and between Lean Rocket Lab and Centrepolis support everything from business strategy to product development to supply chain development and manufacturing. And this is dedicated specifically for Michigan and non-Michigan companies as a way to kind of track businesses to the state of Michigan as well. And what makes us unique, if you've never worked with us, is we try to work with companies that are early in the product development cycle. Again, whether you're a startup or established firm, you're somewhere in your technology readiness area, you're maybe proof of concept, maybe you developed an alpha prototype and need to go to more robust prototypes to get in the hands of customers. Too often what happens with hardware companies is they kind of rush to market, or they don't have a deep enough team that understands material selection, product development, and manufacturing, and maybe don't do a thorough design for manufacturability review. And then they find they get their next prototype in the hands of customers and it doesn't meet the requirements, doesn't perform the way it needs to, maybe is not durable enough, or doesn't meet the right price point. And they find themselves retreating and then having to take on recurring design, engineering, and manufacturing costs all over again. And they lose time and money, and ultimately, the patience of their investors and customers. So what we try to do is work early on and add our team of experts that you see here to support the company, so that they have that kind of deep bench, kind of the power of a General Motors in product development and manufacturing. So these experts in residence, we make a part of the company's teams, and really is an extension to help you meet your goals of developing your product the right way, connecting with the right suppliers, and knowing how to design that product for manufacturability. We also have a wide variety of business templates that are part of this to help you with your business planning, operations, and that also includes investor documents. So we're talking about investment today. We have example investment pitch decks, templates for LLC, C Corp, term sheets, private equity offerings, and then certainly quite a bit of templates and support for product development, like bill of materials templates, as well as supply chain and manufacturing operations documentation. So over the last few years that we've been involved as a hardware accelerator, we've had a lot of success, actually 100% success rate in bringing new products to market for those that we decided to do a deep dive with over the last 2 years alone. And, the numbers kind of speak for themselves. We've had a lot of success in helping develop new companies, job creation. And one area I'm particularly proud about is some of the new capital that we were able to raise for, help support raise for companies over $36 million, as well as the manufacturing contracts that have gone out to suppliers with the client's work. One of the values that we bring is, connecting you to local Michigan design, engineering, and manufacturing partners. So as your company progresses, and so does the Michigan supply chain. We have a unique lab here on the campus of Lawrence Tech, where we can help with prototyping. That could be machining, 3D printing we have available. And we have also a virtual reality, augmented reality product design and simulation studio as well. We also have co-working space opportunities if you need a place to work. These places are available for on a monthly or longer term basis. Other events that we have coming up, we have a Selling Your Products Online webinar a week from today. We're also planning our Hardware Tech Summit, likely to be more of a virtual format, but include a hardware business plan competition. We're also working closely with Automation Alley on their Integrate Industry 4.0 conference scheduled for November. So before we get into the conversation with Lee, since many of you are in the process where you're looking for funding, you're looking to raise money, I wanted to make sure you had a good understanding of the competitive investment landscape here in Michigan. So as an early stage company, you can take advantage of some entrepreneurial support programs that the state of Michigan has. You need to work through a Michigan approved Smart Zone incubator. We are one. There are others that can support you as well, depending on where your region is. But one of the more impressive funding opportunities out there is the Business Accelerator Fund. So we support many companies in trying to secure this funding. The money does not go directly to the client, but it goes directly to the service providers that would you be using to help support your technical or business milestones. And it can support funding anything from on the business side for marketing plans and crowdfunding campaigns and website development to product development and design, engineering, prototyping, testing, evaluation services. What you need for that is an executive summary, some quotes from third-party service providers. They need to be Michigan-based entities, and then evidence of customer traction in the form of purchase orders or LOIs. So if you're interested in that, follow up with us. There's also a wide variety of other programs, an export program for those that are looking to export your product abroad, provide grants that will pay for overseas trips, as well as strategic partnership identification. They also provide free market research to support identification of market entry into select countries. You also have a SBIR, Michigan Emerging Technology Fund program for those that are going after small business innovation research grants, where we'll provide matching dollars if you're awarded that you can use for commercialization activities. And then for more traditional funding, Michigan has what we call mission-based funds and partly supported by the state of Michigan. Michigan Pre-Seed Fund is managed by MSU Foundation, Spartan Innovations, and Red Cedar Ventures, but supports companies all across the state, as does Invest Detroit, which has a wide group of funds that support early stage technology companies. We also have a pretty robust group of angel funds and groups. I'm not going to go over these in detail, but just make these available to you as you want to dig in a little bit deeper. Obviously, many of these are more regional based, as you can tell, and this list continues to grow. Now, Michigan's venture capital network has also grown quite a bit. We have the Venture Capital Association is really the kind of go-to source for understanding what's available, and they also have a great venture capital landscape guide, which has contact information for all the VCs in the state of Michigan. Centrepolis works very closely with investors no matter where they're at. If they have an interest in hardware and advanced manufacturing tech, we work closely with them. So over the years, we've developed great relationship, particularly with hardware investors. Most of these are on the coast, particularly Silicon Valley, some in New York City, and even some abroad. And we've developed relationships with them. We know what their investment interest is, and if it matches your technology and the raise you're trying to make, we can help make connections there. There's also non-traditional funding opportunities, obviously accelerator programs like ours and others. Some are very dedicated to specific types of technologies. They're all across the globe. There's also business plan competitions. We have the Manutech competition we're planning for the fall. And then Accelerate Michigan is the kind of marquee business plan competition held every fall. Not sure if they're going to continue that this year, so I kind of have a TBD there. And then for hardware companies, it's also important to look at crowdfunding campaigns, either through Kickstarters, kind of pre-sell your product as one way to generate revenue that can help support the tooling and manufacturing build out that helps you get to market, or even in the case of crowdfunding for equity as one other way to help raise money for your business. There's a wide variety of other kind of non-traditional. We're seeing a lot of social mission-based funds, as you see here, that are kind of dedicated to environment or recycling type technologies, and certainly those that are for underserved entrepreneurs. There's also a wide variety of loan programs. Again, this is just a resource for you to look at later that are dedicated for both early stage companies as well as mature firms. SBA and Grow Michigan are pretty common for those that are trying to scale up their manufacturing. And then increasingly, there are very dedicated funds for supporting women-led ventures like Bell Michigan here in the state, as well as STIA, that's more national. And then new funds that I'm seeing every day pop up for underserved entrepreneurs. So again, we'll make this list available for you. If you need any guidance, we will work with you on which investment resources and funding make the most sense for your business. So with that said, I want to transition and introduce our speaker, Lee Kellert. And I'm going to let him, this is going to be more of a conversation between me and Lee. Lee has a lot of expertise in this area. I personally, for those that don't know me, I have my own businesses and I've raised money for my companies, so I'll be sharing some of my experiences as well. If you have questions, again, use the chat feature and we'll try to get to your questions. But Lee, you wouldn't mind first taking a few minutes to kind of tell your story, a little bit about your background and your role at Jaffe's Jaffe Law Firm.
Sure. So I've been in practice for about 20 years. I've spent my entire career at Jaffe, and I've done a number of things while I've been there. I started out principally as a public company securities lawyer. But that was very close to when the dot-com implosion occurred. So I quickly transitioned out of that and started working with early stage companies and fundraising and mergers and acquisitions. And I would say that about 60% of my time is really spent on mergers and acquisitions and all the various aspects of a transaction like that. And about the remainder of my time is spent in a combination of handling general corporate matters for clients and assisting companies with fundraising, both on the debt and equity side. I see all sorts of different kinds of companies, from companies that are based almost 100% in intellectual property to straight manufacturing businesses and all sorts of different kinds of industries. So I've had the luck of not being pigeonholed to doing one particular thing. I kind of consider myself to be a very well-rounded legal professional. I work with both entrepreneurs and private equity funds on acquisitions, dispositions, and all aspects of fundraising, as well as serving as outside general counsel to portfolio companies of private equity funds and venture capital funds. So I like to think of myself as a jack of all trades. As an M&A professional, you have to be well-rounded, and you have to understand various aspects of the law and of business, and that's how I consider myself. So I'm very excited to present and have this conversation with Dan today about how to prepare a company for investment and some of the other issues and concerns and aspects of raising money. And hopefully you'll find that our conversation is helpful.
Yeah, and Lee, I've been fortunate enough to work with Lee on, supporting my own companies and several of our clients, provide great guidance to us on, just what do we need to even do as a company just to be even ready to talk to investors, right? That's the starting point. So let's jump in right there. Lee, can you talk a little bit about some of the kind of the must-dos in getting your company ready to even speak to investors in a credible way?
Sure. So I think that the top two items are really, how much money do you need and how are you going to spend it? That's sort of critical. And it's very important to investors to understand exactly how you're going to use their money. So I would say before you do anything else, you need to have a good handle on exactly how much you need and what you intend to use it for. And simply saying that, hey, I'm going to use it for general corporate purposes or working capital, that really won't cut it in today's climate. You need to be very mindful about how you're going to spend the money, what you're going to spend it on. And you need to demonstrate to investors that you've done your research and that you understand your needs, so that they can feel confident that when their money comes in, it'll be spent on the right things. The worst thing that can possibly happen in a company that's looking to raise money is you take in a bunch of dollars and then you can't spend it.
Yeah. So Lee, I think, what I was always surprised about being involved in so many investor meetings, and I've obviously run an investment fund now for the I4O Accelerator, and used to run an investment fund when I was back at, running Next Energy's entrepreneurship program. How, the things that investors really, challenged companies on, right? Performa, right? And how rock solid that is, for instance. So can you talk a little bit about what investors expect from a company, especially with the financials?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of different aspects here. I mean, one of the things that always frustrates me as a lawyer is stepping into a situation where a company doesn't have what I call their corporate house in order. They don't have a good handle on their organizational documents. They don't have a good handle on where their material contracts are. They don't necessarily have all their intellectual property protections lined up. They don't have all of it in one sort of central location. So organization is key. Investors want to understand both risk and reward. And the more organized you are, the better you come off to an investor. So when I say, get your corporate house in order, what I really mean is have, your organizational documents ready and available for investors. Make sure that there are no issues with those organizational documents. So go over them with your counsel first. Make sure that you have your intellectual property in a place where it's understandable and organized, and that you've got the protections lined up, like invention assignment agreements and confidentiality agreements and the like. And I think, to Dan's point, critical are projections. I mean, every investor is going to ask for projections. They're going to ask for pro forma financial statements. And in the startup phase, they're largely guesses. What do we think it's going to look like? They're based on certain assumptions. So you need to have a quality set of projections that are based on reasonable assumptions, and you need to be in a position where you can explain those assumptions to investors. So they want to ask you, okay, well, I'm looking at your cash flow projections. What were your assumptions? How did you get from point A to point B? And you need to be prepared, as someone who's running the business and running the offering, to answer those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and particularly, we deal with a lot of hardware companies, right? So what I found is investors really challenge the cost of goods sold. Have they included all the costs, both direct and indirect? Have they really thought through, their packaging and fulfillment costs? And then do they understand, based on that, you have to produce that, your product up front. So that might be 3 months before a sale. And how do you really know your cash flow requirements? So those are areas that definitely we found, if you're not prepared to answer those questions, you're going to expect that investors are going to, not have a lot of confidence in your team and in your business.
That's absolutely correct, Dan. I completely agree with you there.
What else scares away investors, Lee? I mean, what is it about maybe the documentation or the status of the company that would scare away investors?
Well, I think, again, investors they're scared of contingent liability. So if there's litigation that's outstanding, they're scared of, if your business is based very much on intellectual property, that you don't have the appropriate intellectual property registrations. You don't have your patent in order, or you don't have your trademarks in order, or you've had outside developers that have worked on your product and you don't have invention assignment agreements from those individuals. So what scares investors is really the unknown. And if they see smoke, so they see there's an issue, okay, well, we don't have invention assignment agreements, or there's a litigation that's outstanding with a former employee over development of intellectual property, they're going to assume there's fire, and that the rest of the business, there are issues. So it raises a red flag. So you want to try to avoid those red flag issues before you go out and try to raise money. If you know they're out there, there's a way to mitigate them, and that's having a conversation with your counsel and your business advisors to kind of go through, how do we mitigate whatever is out there in terms of a contingent liability? How do we explain that to investors? So you have to be prepared. But that's what I think investors are principally concerned about, which is the unknown. And again, if they see smoke, if they see an issue, they will assume that there's fire.
Yeah, and your earlier point too about being prepared to understand how you plan to use the proceeds. I mean, this comes up in every investor meeting I've ever been in, right? How do you plan on using the funds? You said you're asking for, $500,000. Who's going to be your first hire? Are you using some of that money for tooling and marketing? And how will that investment in your company help you accomplish certain milestones at certain time frames, right? That's what investors are looking for.
That's exactly right. And they want to know what their money is going to be spent on, and how that's going to drive revenue and ultimately drive a return to them.
Yeah. So let's switch to valuation. This is complicated for those that maybe have never established a valuation for their company. And obviously it's a requirement as you get into discussion with investors. So tell us a little bit about, Lee, kind of what you suggest, and especially for a lot of the companies that are on the phone, they're more early stage, which can be kind of complicated to be able to come up with a very accurate valuation.
I agree. It's tough. It's a difficult thing to do, especially for a startup. I mean, you have no history of revenue, no history of income. You sort of just have a concept, an idea, a product, and what's that worth? Well, I think a lot of times what I found is founders have a somewhat inflated view of what the business is worth. And that's okay. I mean, they put a lot of time and energy and blood, sweat, and tears into developing this thing, and it's important to them. So in a startup phase, what I find is, unless you've gone out and hired some third party to conduct a valuation, is a lot of times it's a negotiation between the investors and the founders. And it's really driven by how much money you want to raise and how much of the company you're willing to give away. So just as an example, if you want to raise $1 million and you only want to sell 10% of the company for that $1 million, that's an implied pre-money valuation of $10 million. It's pretty simple. And if investors are willing to put in money at that valuation, great. But they may say, hey, you want to raise $1 million. I want 20% of the company for $1 million. And if that's the case, now your valuation pre-money is only $5 million. So it's really kind of a give and take between what investors are willing to put in exchange for how much of the company they get in return. And you can get really complicated with this. I just want to give you basically a very simple example that's using easy numbers. But you can get more difficult. You can get into more really complicated waterfalls and distributions based on future events. But really, it's a lot of give and take, especially at the startup phase.
Yeah, and when you get into, we have also established firms, right, that we work with that are participating on this webinar today. It's a little bit easier to calculate, right, based on revenues and many years of P&L, correct?
Yeah, that's right. A more developed, a more robust operating business has historical financial statements. And I'm sure everyone's heard of, it's based on EBITDA and, some multiple of EBITDA, and it's very industry specific. There's also other factors that go into it, customer concentration, for example. If 90% of your business is from one customer, although the EBITDA multiple in your industry may be 10x, you may not be able to get a 10x multiple because you've got significant customer concentration. So a lot of that goes into the determining whether, what multiple to apply and what your company is worth. But it's largely driven, again, based on, revenue, net income, or EBITDA, and what the multiple is in the market. But I kind of go back to my first point, which is even at a more developed stage, there really is always some give and take between what the founders want and what investors are willing to take. So, again, even though you may say, well, I'm in the biotech space and the valuations are crazy, the multiples are 15, 20x, an investor may say, yeah, that's all well and good, but I'm not willing to do that.
And Lee, talk a little bit about some tactics you can use too. I think what I've often found frustrating is we have a lot of investors on the hook, private investors, angel investors, even VCs at times, both with my companies and with the clients that we support. And they just can't seem to make a decision, right? So what are some tactics you can use, like discounted valuations that can kind of get a call to action?
That's a really good suggestion, Dan. I mean, let's take a real world example. In a startup phase, a lot of times startups will raise money using some kind of convertible debt. So that's a loan that's convertible into equity at some point in the future. And usually it's convertible at a discount. So for example, if you want to raise, if you think your valuation is $10 million, what you may say is, well, loan us money and we'll convert your debt into our next round of equity at a 20% discount. So instead of $10 million, it's now $8 million. And that means that it's sort of an instantaneous return for an investor. If the company were to then liquidate immediately after the conversion, you would make an automatic 20% on your money. So that's what I call a sweetener, and that tends to entice investors to make a decision because, again, they sort of have a built-in return. In my example, it would be a built-in automatic 20% return.
Great. And I want to remind everyone that if you have questions, use the chat function. We'll be getting to all the questions that are submitted. But I want to transition into how a company can instill investor confidence, right? We talked a little bit about that up front, but Lee, you've been through this. You've helped literally hundreds and hundreds of companies, right? What are the kind of recommendations you provide?
Well, the Boy Scout motto is really applicable here, and that's be prepared. You need to be prepared to understand your market. You need to be prepared to understand your product. And what that means is not just understanding the upside, but also understanding the downside and risks that are associated with running the business. You need to be prepared to discuss those with investors and how to mitigate them. I think what that gives investors is, wow, this team really understands the market, understand the business. They understand the risks. They've put in place mitigation strategies, or they have mitigation strategies. And this is a good team.
And I think a lot of companies are a little bit afraid to kind of show their own hand, right? They don't want to show the warts of the company, but can you talk a little bit about what you can do as a company, like a formal risk assessment and mitigation plan?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that unless there's a specific identified risk, I don't know that you need necessarily something that's a formal risk mitigation plan. But in terms of being prepared, your team needs to be in a position where the team can address potential changes in the market. I mean, now we're living in incredibly strange times, and it's very difficult to predict supply chain, for example. But what happens if your cost of goods sold go up automatically by 20%? How are you going to handle that? So you need to be prepared as a founder, as an operational team, to address those kinds of issues and concerns.
Yeah, and I found when, investment's all about risk, right, Lee? So, investors, when they see that the team has a good handle on what the risks are for the company, whether it be technical, competitive, market, regulatory, otherwise, right? Then they have generally a lot more confidence in that team, right? Which, may make the difference in them investing or not.
That's very true. Another thing that adds sort of credibility to your process and credibility just generally is your advisors. Are you on this venture on your own, or do you have quality advisors at business, financial, legal? I found that if I'm on the investor side and I'm representing an investor, it gives me confidence to know that the entity that's raising money has a well-known, well-respected accounting firm, law firm. They've engaged, business advisors. They have been a part of an accelerator program like Centrepolis. That adds a lot of credibility just generally to the whole process and to the company as a whole.
Yeah, I agree, definitely. So, and I think the importance too of making sure when you come in, you are speaking to the investor and what the return is, right? Is sometimes even gets overlooked a bit in approach, correct?
That's right, but we shouldn't be naive. I mean, investors are putting money in principally to generate a return, and different kinds of investors have different kinds of return in mind. A venture capital fund, or a private equity fund, or some other professional investor isn't necessarily looking for immediate cash flow. They're more looking for an exit, 3, 5, 7 years in the future. What's that going to be worth? What's the return on my investment going to be looking? What will it look like at that point? So they're kind of looking for the home run. But an angel investor, or a friends and family, or an individual, or a family office, or something similar to that, may be looking for cash flow. So you kind of have to know your audience in terms of, where you're at in your organizational stage, what round of investment you're in. Those kinds of things play into, how you might structure a return. And, as I said, a smaller investor, an individual, or a family office, or an angel, they might be looking for cash flow. But a venture capital fund, they're not necessarily looking for the cash flow. They're looking for the return on an exit. So that would play into how you structure your offering, is sort of know your audience.
Yeah, one of the questions that just came in was talking about, you made an early reference of 20% return over time. And how important is it to, when you're pitching investors or just meeting with them, to show scenarios of return, like 20% over time? What does that look like? What would an acquisition scenario look like? What would dividend returns look like? How important is that, Lee?
Well, again, I think it goes back to knowing your audience. If you're talking about an individual or an angel investor, that's very important to them. They want to know, well, what's the cash flow look like? Am I going to be able to take dividends or distributions out of this business? How am I going to realize a return on my investment? Is it going to be cash flow distributions over time? Is this a long-term hold? Is it a build and sell? Am I going to make my money back plus my return on an exit? So it's important. It kind of goes back to knowing your audience. And I do think that those kinds of pro formas and those kinds of projections are important. And it just depends on where you're at. I think as a startup, to show that kind of information, it's a little speculative. As a more developed business, where you have a product that you're selling or a service that you're selling, and you're generating revenue consistently, and you're hoping for growth, and you've got that projected, it becomes more concrete. So it kind of just depends as where you're at in your organizational history and status, but and who your audience is.
And one thing I would definitely point out is to seek counsel from people that have a lot more experience with this. I mean, I have Lee to thank even for the way we've structured our returns for one of our companies. And, I had struggled to really think through what was the appropriate approach for dividends. And by the way, you can make some mistakes here that would even turn off investors, right? Like if you're saying you're going to promise a big dividend on revenues, and you need the small amount of net income that you've made for cash flow to be able to allow your company to meet your goals, an investor will look at that and say, you really don't know what you're doing, right? So, you can structure where you provide dividends only when you meet certain revenue and net income thresholds, and then distribute a percentage of pool to your shareholders. So again, seek counsel where you can, especially if you don't have a lot of experience in this area. So let's shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about, what our options are for our company, right? There's quite often when I'm working with companies, they're asking me, should I be incorporated as a C corp? Should it be an S corp? Should it be an LLC? Can you talk to this, and Lee, to give some advice?
Sure. And we could spend an hour talking about choice of entity. So I'll try to be as brief as I can. A couple years ago, before tax reform, this was really easy. 90% of the time we would counsel clients that you want to form an LLC. It gives you the most amount of flexibility. It's a complete freedom of contract. You can create your LLC agreement in any way that you want, in terms of how you govern your entity, how you exit the business, and how your, what I call a waterfall, and that's just a term that we use to talk about how you distribute money, both cash flow distributions and on an exit or on a capital event. So it's complete freedom of contract. So that's why, as lawyers, we like it, because we can really do whatever we want, and we can make the waterfall, as I described it, as simple or as complicated as we need to, based on the business. And it's completely scalable. So you can have a very simple waterfall at the beginning, but as you bring on more and more investors, it can get complicated. And in an LLC structure, we can draft that in any way that we want.
So Lee, talk about that a little bit. Do you ever get to a point where an LLC becomes too complicated? I guess ideas would be, or things that would drive that might be having too many equity members or too complicated of a cap table. What's your take on that?
I actually don't think so, Dan. I don't think that it's ever too complicated to be in an LLC. I do think that at some point it becomes too complicated to be in a corporate structure.
Mhm.
I think that a C corp is, or a corporation is a creature of statute, and you're limited by what you can do in your organizational documents, and it has to be very lockstep. And at some point, it becomes very, very complicated to use a corporation versus an LLC. I almost think that the more complicated that your waterfall or that your corporate structure is, the better off you are in an LLC versus a corporation. I would say that that's my preference. There are others that may disagree with me, although I doubt that. I think that the LLC just really gives you so much more flexibility, in terms of providing incentives to employees or to independent contractors, for example. In a corporate structure, to do it on a sort of tax deferred or tax free basis, it's difficult, and you're limited to just options. But in an LLC, you've got sort of the maximum amount of flexibility to do what you want. You can give options. You can give something called a profits interest, which is real equity that employees and contractors can have, and it's on a tax deferred basis. You can't do that in a corporation. Another feature of the LLC that I think is important, especially in the development stage, and this is, again, probably more important to individuals or angels or what I would call like professional investors, is the ability to use losses. So an LLC typically is a pass-through entity, meaning that it doesn't pay income taxes at the LLC level. It flows through to the individual owners. And if there are losses, meaning that there's research and development costs, etc., those losses flow through to the investors, and they're able to use them against their personal taxes. You can't do that in a C corp. In a C corp, those losses are what we call trapped, and they generate non-operating losses that can be used later against net income or taxable income at the corporate level. So you don't have that issue in an LLC.
Yeah, and I think this is an important point to transition as we even had a question on, when investors require you to become a C corp, and why is that? And so can you talk to that, Lee, a little bit?
Sure. There's lots of things that can drive that. I think they understand C corps. C corps, you have to have a board of directors. The board of directors has fiduciary duties, which are mandatory legal obligations that directors owe to the shareholders. There's a ton of case law about how those operate and what that means, and limitations on what you can do as a director. So there's the governance function of it. There's also a tax issue. A lot of times venture capital funds have nonprofits or foreign investors in their funds. And in order to avoid some fairly sticky tax issues for those investors, they have to invest through a C corp because it's a taxable entity. So there's something called UBTI, or it's a tax term that applies to nonprofits, and it makes certain kind of income that's generated 100% taxable to nonprofits. There's also another thing called PFIC, which is with respect to foreign investors, that could cause the amount of money that they receive from an investment to be significantly taxed. So as a result, a lot of venture capital funds mandate that they invest into a C corp in order to avoid those issues for their investors. There's a way around that. I mean, they can invest through something called the blocker. So a venture capital fund could create a corporation to invest in an LLC, and that solves the problem. Sometimes if it's one venture capital fund that's going to provide a significant investment to a business, they may say, hey, we don't want to deal with that. We just want you to convert to a C corp. I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I imagine as a minority investor, if a venture capitalist comes in, it establishes some real, requirements around the team, and the fiduciary responsibilities that they like to see. It might even allow them to get a seat on the board and other things to have more of a say in day-to-day operations, right?
That's accurate. And they have, frankly, probably arguably more protection in a corporate structure because of the law and the case law around, directors of a corporation and the like. Although I will tell you that in Delaware, for example, in an LLC, you can actually, by contract, eliminate fiduciary duties and on the managers completely. So, if you're willing to do that, that would give the VC fund a lot of comfort that, okay, they're not now exposed to minority investors.
Yeah, and I found with hardware companies, traditionally, venture capital firms do not invest in hardware. There are some exceptions. So, LLCs have proven to be maybe even more of a preferred corporate entity, right, to take on especially private investors and still have a lot of control over your day-to-day operations, correct?
I think that's accurate. And another benefit of an LLC versus a C Corp is you can always take your LLC and convert it to a C Corp without any negative tax consequences. You can't do it the other way around.
Yeah. So earlier you talked about LLC in Delaware, but what I've seen with even some of my companies, my clients, when they convert to a C Corp, they typically incorporate in Delaware or Nevada. Why is that?
Well, I think it's principally based on the court system. In Delaware, for example, Delaware has a court system called the Chancery Court, and the Chancery Court has been around for a long time, and it's set up solely to hear disputes on corporate matters. So all of the case law that has come out, all of the seminal cases on corporate matters have come out of Delaware or New York, but New York has really fallen by the wayside and it's now just Delaware. It's an expedited review process. It's really the place that you want to be if you need to have a corporate dispute heard. In my experience, I've been through a couple of these where we've had, issues that have come up, and it's really the interpretation of governing documents or, the interpretation of a shareholders agreement or a limited liability company agreement where I've been in front of the Chancery Court and we participated in sort of an expedited review process, and they have an optional mediation, and it's been excellent. And the judiciary, they're practitioners, they understand the law. And again, it's really the place that you want to be if you have a dispute. So in my opinion, that's the driving reason for why you would form your entity in Delaware. The breadth of the case law, the experience, the judiciary, and very well drafted statutes.
Yeah, which is why investors would prefer that too. Yeah, makes sense. So let's talk about S corps and other forms.
Yeah, so a partnership, we'll just dispense with that one pretty easily. You never want to form a general partnership. That's each partner is jointly and severally liable for all of the debts of the partnership. A general partnership doesn't give you liability protection as an owner. A limited partnership is very, very similar to an LLC, has the same tax functions. The only difference is you have limited partners and a general partner. And a general partner is like the director or a manager. But otherwise, it's very, very similar to an LLC. But it's an older entity, and I think it's sort of fallen by the wayside. And it's used a lot in real estate transactions and for private equity funds. But for the most part, LLCs are the way to go. So you often hear S corps. Well, that's it gives me that flow through taxation that we talked about for LLCs. But the issue with an S corp, especially if you want to take in investor dollars, is you can only have one class of stock. That's it. And you can't have an entity own an S corp. Only individuals, certain kinds of trusts, and single member LLCs. But otherwise, you can't have a corporation, for example, or a partnership own an interest in an S corp. So it really, really restricts you, and it just isn't viable if you intend to take in investor dollars.
Let's talk about, we've talked a lot about LLC versus C Corp, but I think a lot of it really largely depends on the type of business you really want, right? Long term, and if you really want to develop and manufacture versus really looking for some type of exit, right, Lee?
That's right. So, you know, I had this in the presentation. We didn't really touch on it, but for example, if you know you intend to build the business and then sell it at 6-7 years out in the future, you may want to think about something called 1202. You may want to think about a corporation and its small business stock. And if you qualify for Section 1202, you can shield the first $10 million of gain on exit per shareholder. So that means each shareholder gets $10 million effectively tax-free. And there's certain hoops that you have to jump through in order to qualify, and you truly have to be a small business. But that may be very attractive if you intend to hold the stock for 5 years or more. But that you must hold the stock for 5 years. If you hold it for 4 years and 363 days, and that's when you sell, you're not eligible. So that might be attractive. If you have a cash flow model where you intend to sort of distribute cash flow, and maybe it's a long-term hold, an LLC might be a much better option for you because it's easier to make those kinds of distributions. If you ever wanted to do something called a dividend recap, which is, okay, my business is doing really well, I want to go out and borrow some money from a financial institution and use that money to make a distribution to my owners. You can do that, and you can do that in a very tax efficient way. In an LLC, you can't do that in a corporation. So it just depends on what your long-term plans are. Is it a build and sell? Is it a build and hold with cash flow distributions? All that really is going to drive your choice of entity and what sort of structure you use.
And let's dig a little bit deeper into dividends and distributions and the importance of that for shareholders, Lee.
Sure. And I think this goes back to sort of knowing your audience. As we talked about earlier, an angel or an individual or maybe a family office, they may be more concerned about cash flow. So they may want cash flow distributions. So they may be interested in a model that's more of a longer term hold that provides for cash flow distributions, as opposed to private equity fund or a venture capital fund that isn't really focused necessarily on taking cash out of the business during the hold period, but is more focused on what will my return be. So that really drives how you might set up your distributions. In a cash flow distribution model, you might provide for specific metrics for how cash flow is distributed. So if you have a certain amount of net income or a certain amount of excess cash, you may have in your distribution waterfall that a certain percentage has to be distributed on a quarterly or a biannually or on an annual basis. But if you aren't in a cash flow model and you're more in okay, we're going to build this and sell it at some point in the future, you may still provide for a preferred return or some sort of interest rate on investor dollars, but you wouldn't actually pay that out. It would just accrue. One other thing to be mindful of as you're sort of thinking about the future is, okay, I've got angel investors that I've attracted and they want cash flow and they're interested in a cash flow model, but I intend to grow this thing. And at some point in the future, I need to borrow money. I need to borrow money from a bank. A lot of lenders are reluctant to allow companies, while their debt is outstanding, to distribute all or a big portion of their cash flow. So you may be limited by your lender and your ability to make those cash flow distributions. And that's something that you need to be prepared for in advance and need to have a discussion with your potential investors about.
Greatly. Again, I want to remind those that are on the phone, we have a few minutes left. I'd like to address those that have some questions. One question that came up, and I know you and I have talked about this a lot, Lee, is the use of a tech holding company, right? And where that might become particularly important if you have a strong patent portfolio and how you may want to have, two different entities. Can you talk to that?
Sure. I think that's a very common structure. I think that one of the positives about that is liability protection. Certainly if you have an issue with your manufacturing operation where there's a lawsuit or a potential a liability on your manufacturing operation, if you hold that your intellectual property in a separate entity, a separate legal entity, it wouldn't be affected necessarily by the lawsuit or the liability on the manufacturing operation. The other thing that it gives you the ability to do is if, for example, you're manufacturing your product and you find that a couple years down the road there's another alternative to manufacture that's far less expensive, you have the ability to then shut down your manufacturing operation and license your intellectual property. But it doesn't hurt you on a sale. You can always sell the intellectual property separately. You can sell it as part of the transaction with the manufacturing operation. It just gives you more flexibility, and it gives you a lot of liability protection. So it's a good structure if you're in a position where one of your critical assets or one of your most valuable assets is intellectual property.
Thanks, Lee. The question came in about convertible notes. Are they good? Are they bad? I hear stories where convertible notes with a term of 12 months can't be paid back, and then investors, seize the assets of the company and take over the company. Can you talk about convertible notes?
Absolutely. I mean, I would say that convertible notes are pretty common, but we really use them as a bridge. So a convertible note is okay. We need some startup capital, and we intend to raise equity at some point very, very near in the future. So 6, 9, 12 months, we intend to raise money. We're hell bent on raising money. We need this sort of seed capital in order to get us over the hump. So that's how convertible notes are used. I see them used inappropriately all the time, whereas you don't have that second offering on the horizon and you need to bring money in the door. So, okay, I'm going to raise money using a convertible note. And then you get 12 months out or 18 months or whatever the maturity date is, and you haven't raised any additional equity, and you don't have any plans to raise any additional equity, but you can't pay back the notes. So, it's just a question of how close are you with your investors? Can you negotiate something? Can you convert them into equity at that point? And also, is the note secured or unsecured? And unsecured convertible debt means that they can't come after the assets. They just have a right to get a judgment against you for whatever the amount of the convertible note is. A security interest, meaning that the debt is secured, means that they could in fact seize the assets. So when you are drafting these convertible notes and you're thinking about, well, what are my plans? You need to be mindful of these. And you can of course build provisions into the convertible note that it's a mandatory conversion on maturity if it can't be repaid. So there's definitely some flexibility, and there isn't what I would call necessarily a standard form. There is a standard that everybody goes by, but everything's negotiable. So it's a lot of give and take between potential investors.
Well, Lee, I think that the answer to that is it depends. It depends on the terms, right? So we have to.
That's right.
Again, another reason really to seek professional opinion on this and to reach out to folks at Jaffe, folks like Lee that really understand this and have seen what has gone wrong and what has gone right over time. So I think it's important to seek counsel. And here's Lee's contact information. If you want to reach out directly to Lee, we weren't able to get all the questions I would like to have been able to get to today, and we're at the 11 o'clock hour, so we need to sign off soon. Again, the presentation will be made available to those that registered, and we also recorded the session for those that registered and couldn't be with us today. So thank you, Lee, for your time. Thank you for those that participated. And feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions specifically about your business and how we can help you get your company ready for investors.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everyone and the time, and I hope this was helpful.
It was. Thank you very much, Lee.
All right. Thank you.
Signing off. Thank you, everyone. Take care.